Welcome back. In this video, we'll talk about the 5 function machine techniques. That sounds like a mouthful, but it's really just a phrase I came up with to help us build a framework around 5 common ways that we'll use our models. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to do a math review. And the reason I want to do this is a few years ago when I started teaching, I wasn't really sure what the students had covered. And so I would ask them, have you covered efficient frontier? Have you covered how to value a bond? Have you covered time value of money? And they would always shrug and look at me like they'd never heard of these terms. Dr. Stanhouse said, Tom, ask them if they've covered addition, and I'll bet they say no. So I haven't done that. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but we're going to back up and start in grade school for that reason. After the grade school math review, we'll talk about the function techniques, and there are 5 of them. I won't read the slide to you. But this presentation is just an overview. So after we get through this, there'll be a deep dive on each of the 5 techniques, but I think it's important to see them here all at once to put them into context. Grade school math review. So function machines. When my kids were in about 2nd grade, they told me that they learned about function machines. And function machines, they said, were a thing that would take an input, apply some kind of a math rule to it, and produce an output. For example, if I had this list of inputs, 2, 3, and 4, and I got this list of outputs, 4, 5, and 6, that corresponded, then what would the math rule be there? Pause the video, think about it, and you'll come up with x plus 2. So x plus 2 is our math rule in this case. It takes a 2, adds 2, and gets a 4. It takes a 3, adds 2, and gets a 5. It takes a 4, adds 2, and gets a 6. Another math rule might take a 2 and give us a 4, but turn that 3 into a 9 and the 4 into a 16. What would that math rule be? You guessed it, x squared. Okay, let's do it the other way. Let's say if we had a math rule x minus 5, what would that do to a 10? It would make it a 5. What would that math rule do to a 15? It would make it a 10. Turn a 20 into a 15. You see where I'm going with this. We're taking inputs, applying a math rule, or in our case a model, and creating outputs. Let's do it one more time. A little bit more sophisticated math rule, 2x plus 1. So 2 times 2 plus 1 is 5. 2 times 3 plus 1 is 7. And 2 times 4 plus 1 is 9. This is our framework for this video. This idea of a function machine that takes one or more inputs and produces one or more outputs. Before I go any further, let me jump over to Excel and show you why I chose this ugly Texas color for my inputs and this blah gray color for my outputs. If I'm in Excel and I want to format a cell, I could do that by shading it. I could pick any of these colors. I could change the font to any particular color. I could make the font bold with Control B or italics with Control I. So I have a lot of control over what I do to that appearance of that cell, and it doesn't affect any of the ways that cell gets used. It doesn't affect any formulas or any math or anything like that. There are actually some built-in styles, and if you come up here to the Home menu and go to Cell Styles, for you shortcut users, that would be Alt-H for Home, and then J for Cell Styles, and these are the built-in cell styles. And I'm not going to fight the system. I'm just going to go ahead and use what Microsoft chose for the input and for the output. In this class, I think it's safe to say those are the only 2 built-in cell styles that we'll use, are the input and the output. So when you see them in the video like this, you'll know where I got those styles. And throughout this course, anytime you see this ugly Texas color, then you'll realize, oh, that must be an input. And anytime you see this washed out gray color, realize that must be an output. The first function machine I would like to talk about is the what if data table. And what this one does, it runs the model repeatedly to show the sensitivity of outputs to inputs. In fact, it does exactly what we did on the last slide. If I have a list of inputs, then it will run my model for as many rows as I want in that table and create a corresponding list of outputs. That's great if I wanted to create a graph or just see a little table of, hey, if I'm looking at buying a house and the interest rates could be any of these on this list, what would my payment be on a corresponding list? So you can imagine a lot of uses for a what-if data table. The way to create a what-if data table after you've selected your range is go to Data, What-if Analysis, and Data Table. And then this little window will pop up. It will say, so that list of inputs in my example interest rates, where do those go in the model? And depending on the shape of the data table, it might be a row input or a column input. What do I mean by the shape of the data table? Well, we could have a one variable vertical columns only data table, and it would look like this, like the ones we saw on the previous slide. And look at this example. This is using our course grade model that says if I get a 75 on the final, I'll get an 86 in the class and a B in the class. If I get an 85 on the final exam, I'll get an 88 in the class, which is a B. But if I could get a 95 on the exam, then I'd get a 90, which is an A. So in this case, we have one input, that's a final exam, going into this function machine. And then we have two outputs, the course grade and the letter grade, coming out of the function machine. In this case, the function machine math rule is our course grade model. We could get the same exact data with a one variable horizontal or row inputs only data table. Look, it answers the same questions. It says if I got a 75 on the final, I'd get an 86, which is a B in the class. If I got an 85 on the final, I'd get an 88, which is a B in the class. And if I got a 95 on the final, I'd get a 90, which is an A in the class. So same exact data, just transposed. Now, if we still had two inputs, we wanted to put two inputs into this function machine and get output out, how would we do that? We'd use a two variable data table. This one has both column and row inputs. So we could say we don't know what we got on quiz 4 yet. So there's some uncertainty not only on this final exam score where we could get a 75, an 85, or a 95, also some uncertainty on quiz 4. We could get anywhere from an 80 to 100 on that, according to our data table. So look what happens. If we get an 80 or an 85 or a 90, at least an 80 or an 85, let's say, doesn't change anything in the model. But when we get a 90 or a 95 or a 100, then quiz 4 starts to affect our course grade. Think about why that might be. Of course, it's because we get to drop the lowest quiz, and apparently our lowest quiz in this model was somewhere between an 85 and a 90. And when quiz 4 got higher than that, then all of a sudden quiz 4 wasn't getting dropped like it was if it were an 80 or an 85. So just to illustrate one last time, if I got an 85 on the final and a 95 on quiz 4, I would get an 89.7 in the class. Now, under my course grading scheme, that's a B, but we don't have a way in a two variable data table to say that, do we? Think about it. Up here, we could only have room for one input, but I could make as many columns of outputs as I wanted. Down here, I only had room for one input and as many rows of outputs as I wanted. Here, I can have two inputs and only one output. If you can figure out a way to geometrically make that work in a spreadsheet better than that, let me know, but that's the limitation on what-if data tables in Excel. So let's go back to this yellow box, row input cells and column input cells. I struggled with which was which for the longest time. And let me tell you the answer so you'll see where we're going with this. The final exam score, that's the cell that I would choose for the row input cell. And the quiz 4 score is the cell I would choose to put all these different possibilities for quiz 4 into the course grade model. And then when I do that, the course average up here in the corner is what gets populated into the table. So let's apply that to the 1D tables. The one that only has columns of inputs, I would actually put those in the column input cell. And the one that only has rows of inputs, I would only put in the row input cell. Now, believe it or not, I spent 22 years not remembering which was which. I would take these and plug it into the row input cell and it wouldn't work. And I'd say, okay, that must be wrong. Let me go back and plug it into the column input cell, and it would work. And then when I started teaching this class, a student asked me, well, how do you know which is which? So I took the 10 seconds, maybe 5 seconds that I should have taken 22 years ago to stop and think, when they're in a column, they go in the column input cell. And when they're in a row, they go in the row input cell. I know that's a complicated method that Microsoft came up with, but once you figure it out, it will help you a lot to know which cells to plug in. You're probably going, what are you talking about, row input cells? So let's jump over into Excel and find out. You'll recognize this course grade model from the syllabus quiz, I believe, and probably the first week of class. And if we go back to that Alt-HJ, I believe, that gets us to the built-in cell styles to get to input or output. And so look at all the inputs in this model and look at all the outputs, well, 2 outputs. I would argue that quiz grade might actually be an output. So we'll talk more about this in the modeling rules section, but what makes an input and what makes an output is debatable among friends. But one thing that's not debatable is whether it goes on the left side of the function machine or the right side of the function machine. All of these 10 values are going into the function machine, and these 2 gray values are coming out of the function machine. So let's do this. In this video, I think we only care about final exam and quiz 4. So if I don't want quiz 1, 2, and 3 to look like inputs, because let's assume that they've already happened and they're not going to change, our function machine doesn't really care about them anymore, let's copy one of these formats and override those built in. So I'm going to come up here with my arrow key, Control left, Control C to copy, Control down a couple times, down arrow, Shift down arrow, and now I've selected the destination cells. And I want to paste the formats from cell D8 onto cell D13, 14, and 15. So I don't want to paste the 70 in there, but I do want these numbers to be formatted like cell D8 is. So I'm going to do an Alt-H for home, V for paste, S for paste special, and this super dialog box comes up. I love this dialog box because it gives me so much flexibility. I could paste all of the components of this cell, the attributes of this cell, including its value and its formatting. I could paste only the formula in it. I could paste the answer as a value. I could paste only the formatting, and I could paste all these different kinds of things, even the column width, for example. Could do all except the borders. I could even do some math. I could multiply each of these cells by 70, or divide them by 70, or add or subtract. And a lot of things I can do with this paste special. So I got here with Alt-HVS, and notice this little T is underlined. And so if I'll hit a T at this point, it selects formats, and then if I will hit enter for OK, notice how it changed the formatting of these cells but not the contents. Alt-HVST. If you don't like to remember Alt-HVST, I think Control-Alt-V is another way to do that. Let's see. If I come back here, or if I come down here and I want to do a Control-C to copy, and then an up arrow and a Control-Shift up, and do a Control-Alt-V, I get to that same paste special dialog box. And again, I could hit T for formatting and enter for OK. And now the function machine's no longer getting tripped up, or we as users are no longer getting tripped up with these as inputs. Similarly, if we say that our project 1, 2, and participation are already known, then let's do that. Let's do a copy. Now, I learned how to use Excel when there was a menu called Edit. And under the Edit menu, there was a item called Paste Special. And so Alt-ES is how I get to Paste Special, because that's how I learned it. And it's a lot simpler, and I would encourage you to consider Alt-ES. So Alt, and when I say E, look, there's no menu up here that starts with E. And it says, hey, you must be an old guy because we haven't used this E menu in a long time. But if you can remember the rest of it, we'll let you use it. So I remember that the rest of it is S. And so Alt-ES also gets me to this. I call these legacy menus legacy shortcuts or something, but I don't know if that's the right thing to call them or not. So we wanted to Alt-EST, and I forgot to select any more than just project 1. So I could do a number of things. I could do a Control-Y to repeat, or I could just do copy Alt-EST again, enter. And now I've cleaned up this model a little bit so that the only 2 inputs that I'm seeing when I look at this model as a function machine are the quiz 4 and the final exam, because that's really the topic of this slide. So let's build the first. I think it said, I think the first model I showed you said final exam, and then our course average, and then our course grade. And notice what I did there. I typed one thing, I hit tab to go to the right, and I hit tab, and then when I hit enter, it took me down to the next row. So probably your first job is going to have a lot of grunt work in it. You're probably going to be entering a lot of data. So if you're entering a row of data with tab, and you get to the end and you hit enter, it'll take you to the next row. And you can tab until you get to the end of the row and hit enter, and it will so play with enter and tab. Those are two more shortcuts we should know. Okay, now what possibilities are there on the final exam? There are 75, 85, and 95. Now notice there I'm hitting enter and I'm going down instead of to the right, because that's where I needed to go. If I could have hit tab and gone to the right. So 75, 85, and 95. Pay no attention to the fact that I left this cell blank yet. Average. This is where we find out where's the output in the model that we want our function machine to be thinking about. Well, the average. So if I'll go control left, control down, control down, control down, and then up arrow. That's a pretty quick way to get there. So this is our course average, and the grade equals control left, control down, enter. So we've got our average and our grade. I'm going to center those with an Alt-H for home, A, C for align center. So I'll do an Alt-H-A-C on those. And then our answer will show up here, but this is the part that students kind of start to struggle with. They say, I never can remember how to arrange these things. So I started teaching this where I said, well, you're going to want these cells to go into this final exam cell one at a time. And so why don't you format those as inputs? And that was Alt-H-J, and then arrow over to input. And these represent things that are coming out of the function machine. So why don't you select those two with a shift right arrow and do an Alt-H-J and go down and choose outputs. And so these aren't really inputs and outputs in a function machine, I guess. I mean, this is our function machine over here. This is our model. This is just our data table. But I find students relate to this better if they can format these as inputs and these as outputs, especially when you start to build it. Because to build it, a couple of rules. Which cells do I select? One is I want to come in here and select all of those formatted cells, but only enough cells to get all the formatted cells. Okay? If I selected these, I didn't need that top row to get the formatted cell. I want to get rid of that top row from my selection, so I'm going to control period a couple times and control shift down. So I want just this selection. If I had done, let's say this, I didn't select enough cells to get all of the formatted cells, did I? I'm missing those inputs. So I'll shift left again and take those. So once I have that selected and the active cell, I can hit control period, and it can be any of these. I just did that so I could deselect the right rows. It can be anywhere in there. Once I have those cells selected, now I'm ready to do the data what if analysis data table. This is the point where we saw these green cells over here. And I put so much work into this slide that I'm going to back up and show you those green cells again. So data, what if analysis, and data table. And then we have to think about what's a row input cell and what's a column input cell. So Alt-Tab, back over to my Excel. And what I see is data. But you know I'm not going to reach up there and click data with the mouse. You know I'm going to hit the Alt key. And then I'm going to see the A pop up. So I'll hit A for data. W for what if analysis. and T for data table. So Alt AWT gets us to this. And look, there's our familiar box saying, well, where would you like me to put these inputs? I see a column of inputs. I don't see a row of inputs. Now remember what I said about my 22 years of confusion. Don't spend 22 years, just learn it today. That when these inputs are in a column, you care about the column input cell. And so where do these things go? We want them to input into the final exam. When we say OK, what does it do? Well, it plugs the 75 in here, and let's see what a 75 would give us in there. And it gets this 86.3, and it actually pulls it from right here, but I want you to think about it coming from right here. Pulls that 86.3 and puts it in, and it pulls the B and puts it in. And then the next thing it does is go to the next row, and it says, well, what if I had an 85 in that column input cell you told me about? So 85 gives us an 88.3 and a B. Look at that. And 95 gives us a 90.3 and an A. So 95, 90.3 and an A. So when we built this data table, it actually ran the model 3 times, each with a different number going into this input cell. Here in a moment, when we vary our quiz 4, it will run it 3 times, however many options we give it for quiz 4. But before we get there, let's do this. Let's say that was our vertical, or our one variable vertical column inputs only table. Let's do the same thing down here. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to come up here with a cursor and I'm going to select those cells, get that mouse out of the way. I'm going to copy. And remember my old-fashioned shortcut for paste special? It wasn't Alt HVS, which is what you'd get through the menu here. It was Alt ES. I think we also said Control Alt V would pull up this. And here's a handy one. It's called transpose. And you know, I'm just not going to click that. I'm going to hit the E key, which is going to check that box. And then I'm going to hit the Enter key, which is going to do OK. And look what it did. It copied this and transposed it. Now, I'm not certain that it did everything perfectly. For example, look, when we copied, now this is looking at Y9 for some crazy reason. So it doesn't handle formulas too well. But gosh, look how well it did the formatting. So if I come in here and I delete all this stuff, these were just values. It handled them very well. I'm ready to rebuild this data table. Now, what was rule number 1 on selecting data tables? Get enough and only enough to get these formatted cells, right? So that'd be too many, that'd be too few. If I did this, that'd be too many. That would be too many. That would be just right because it's enough and only enough to get those formatted cells. And then I can do that Alt AWT, or being the old school guy that I am, there used to be one called Alt D for data and T for table. And here we have not a column of inputs, but we have a row of inputs. So we're going to tell it this row input cell, these are still final exam scores. And so let's put that in the final exam. And didn't do so well, did it? I forgot to populate these gray cells. So let me populate them now. This is going to be the course average. And enter to go down. And this is going to be control left, control down, the course grade. Look what happens. I can change these things after I build the data table, and it still works. So I'm still getting the correct answers as if I had manually put in those 3 different final exam scores over here. Okay, the last type of data table we will do is a 2 variable. And so here we're going to find our course average based on our final exam score and our quiz 4. It gets a little tricky about where to put these labels, but the labels don't matter. What matters is that in the upper left, we give it the output that we're interested in. And then across the top, we give it those final exam scores. I'm just going to come up here with the control up a couple times, copy, paste. And I'm going to copy and do that Alt ES to get my paste special. I'm going to hit that E again for transpose. So that's an Alt-ESE shortcut to transpose something. And I'll at least get the kind of formatting that I want. These weren't exactly right. And in fact, they weren't enough cells. So I'm going to do an 80 and an 85. Oops. 80, enter. 85. Machine runs kind of slow when I'm trying to record a video. So you may think by now that I hate the mouse. I really don't. I love the mouse for things like this. There's a little handle here on the lower right part of your selected cells that you can click and watch what happens. It counts to, so if that's 85, 90, 95, and 100. And it will count by fives because it noticed, hey, you were counting by fives. If I'd been counting by 2.5s, if that's the thing, if I went from 80 to 82.5, and I came over here and I drug that down, then it would be smart enough to say, hey, you're counting by 2.5. But I'm not, so I'll undo that. So that's how we got those populated. Anyway, it is now time, we need to Alt-H-J to do that as an output. And now we need to select the formatted cells and only enough to get the formatted cells. Do our Alt-DT, or I think you can do an Alt-AWG. Probably something even different on a Mac with accelerator keys, but you'll figure out what your favorite shortcut is for a data table. And then row input cells, remember, don't make my 22-year mistake. Just remember that row input cells are the ones in a row, and since they're the final exam score, they go here. And the column input cell is the ones that are in a column, and they're quiz 4, so they go here. And then we can see, well, what would we have made on if we'd got a 75 on the exam and an 80 on quiz 4, or any other combination. So you get the idea. One last thing that I love to do with 2D data tables. This is included in the price. It's not even on the slide, but if you'll do an Alt-HLS, which gets you to home, of course, is the Alt-H, and then L takes you over here to conditional formatting, and S gives you these color scales. So at least if you don't mess it up with your mouse, it would have given you the color scales. And then if you just hit enter, I think it will choose some default up here, probably where green is high and red is low. So let's do that. Let me undo that and see how my shortcut works. Alt-HLS. So usually after I build a 2D data table, I just go ahead and select those outputs, do an Alt-HLS, and then I can see, well, what's making a bigger difference here? You know, is my quiz 4 driving this thing more, or is my final exam driving it more? And it looks to me like the final exam has a little bit bigger effect on it, partly because quiz 4 is getting dropped in the first 2 rows anyway, but probably because the final exam weighs a little bit more heavily than quiz 4 does, even when quiz 4 counts. So if you like heat maps colored like that, you can do that. If you don't, you can do an Alt-H-L, and it's probably C for clear. Yeah, C to clear those rules. So let's clear them from the entire sheet. Alt-HLS, enter. Alt-HLC, enter. And that is the what if data table function machine technique. What a mouthful. I said there'd be a deep dive on this. I don't know how I can dive much more deeply into that, but we'll try in a subsequent video sometime. Now let's get back to the presentation and see what the next one is. The next function machine technique I'd like to talk about is goal seek. And goal seek's the simplest one. Everybody loves goal seek. It says find the input you need to get the output you want. And you get there by data, what if analysis, goal seek. So if our shortcut for the data table was Alt-A-W-T, our shortcut for the goal seek is Alt-A-W-G. And it pulls up a window that likes this. It says, well, tell me what you want, and tell me what you want it to be equal to, and then tell me what you want to change to get that, and I'll figure out what input you need to put into the function machine to get the desired output. Let's go try that. So what everybody wants to know is, well, what do I need on the final to get an A in the class? Do I really need a 95? Let's see. A-W-G. says set cell G17. Now notice I don't want to change G17, but it automatically populated that because that's where my cursor was. So I'm going to back up and teach you something very important. When you run goal seek, you're going to be thinking about, here's what I want to change. Tell me what you really, really want, right? So I'm going to want to change that. So why don't I select that? If I'll put the cursor on that and do my Alt A W G, now look, the set cell is already set to the objective, which is the way I want it. And then the value, say I want to make a 90 by changing cell, final exam. Here's another good use for the mouse. I can't think of a quick, easy way to get from here to there. I don't want to try to type in D21, so I'm not completely anti-mouse. There's a good use for the mouse. And it says, well, you are going to need a 93.5 on the final to get that. And I said, well, you know what? D for diploma, or maybe B for this being my last semester before graduate. What if I only needed an A, or if I only wanted a B in the class? Alt A W G, and set that value equal to an 80 by changing this cell. And it says, man, if you're ready to graduate and just get out of here with a B, all you need is a 43 on the final. So 43.5, let's be clear there. Now all that, of course, is predicated on the 65 being set. But that's goal seek, everybody's favorite. If we put goal seek on steroids, we get something called solver. And it's a little bit more complicated, but it's so much more powerful. Here we can optimize the output. Not just set it to a certain number, but maybe maximize it or minimize it. You know, if we're trying to maximize profit or minimize cost, that's a big difference between just doing a goal seek to reach some profit or some cost. And we can even put some constraints on some cells. So for example, we go to data. Now we have to have solver installed. We'll get to that in the deep dive. And it pulls up a much more complicated window. And it says, well, what do you really, really want? You want to set D22 equal to something. Maybe you want to maximize it or minimize it, or maybe you really just do want to see what it takes to get an A. And this time we can change more than one cell at once. And so in this example, we're changing D16, which I think was quiz 4, and D21, which was the final exam. In fact, we could, to set this output to whatever we wanted, we could put in a whole lot of different inputs, I think up to about 200 or so. And then we could put some constraints on there. I mean, if you think about it, we're really not going to make higher than 100 on quiz 4, or at least we don't want an answer that requires that. We may think it's unrealistic to make more than a 95 on the final. And we also may think it's unrealistic to do better on the final than we've done on any of the quizzes. So we could go in there and put these constraints in here, and Solver will try to find a solution that gets to all of them. So let's jump over and try that. And since I have the Solver installed, I see it on the ribbon, and I'll show you how to install it just in case I didn't. I'd go to File, Options, Add-ins, and we just happen to know that Solver is an Excel add-in. It came with Excel, so we'd go to Manage Excel Add-ins. We would say Go, and to get Solver, all we need to do is check that box and say OK. I already have the box checked. That's why I see Solver up here on the Data menu in the Analyze group. So happens that I have the Analysis Tool Pack checked as well. You'll use that in some of your other classes, but not mine. And that's why I have the data analysis checked. We're going to do all that stuff by hand. We're not going to take the easy way out. So let's do a solver. So we'll click on that. So when we add these things that aren't built in, there are shortcuts for them. If I do an Alt-A and pull up the data menu, it says, well, you know, Y3 will get you to solver. But if I didn't have data analysis installed, I think solver would probably be Y2. So I'm not going to memorize Alt-A-Y3 to get to solver, and I don't use it enough. But if you end up using it 10 times in a day, you'll probably figure out to use that. I just said I wouldn't use it, but I'll show you that it works. Alt-A-Y3 pulls up the parameters just like we had. So we were trying to set our objective, course average, to 90 by changing the quiz 4 and the final exam grade. And we said, I'll come in here and act like I'm going to change this. We said we don't want that quiz 4 grade. We want to keep it less than or equal to 100. Okay. We want to keep our final exam grade less than or equal to 95. So we're building a little bit of cushion there. We may do better. And then we want to make sure that the final exam grade is less than or equal to the largest of our quiz grades, D13 through 16. So it would be kind of unrealistic to expect to do better on the final than we did on any of our quizzes, so we could do that. Now you may be saying you don't need to limit it to both of those two, but kind of like building models versatile, it's nice to have both of those in there in case we get one of these regraded or something. It won't change our logic here. Now, if we were doubling in a math major, we might care about one of these mathematical algorithms that you can use to solve these nonlinear equations, but we're not, so we're not going to mess with that. We will use this checkbox to make variables non-negative when we're optimizing stocks, unless we want to short stocks. If we're optimizing a portfolio of stocks and we want to short them, then we can uncheck that box and allow us to have a negative holding in a stock. I don't think we want to allow any negative grades in our course grade model, so we'll leave that box checked. And there are probably some other options that would be worth talking about, but I won't go into them here because I need to save something for the deep dive video. And when we solve that, see what answer we get. Oh, this doesn't look good. It says solver could not find a feasible solution. So I could get up to an 89.7, and our professor's a jerk. He won't round that, but let's see. Better say, I don't want to keep that solver solution, so I'm going to cancel. I'm going to go back to solver. I'll just hit it with the mouse here and say, well, gosh, I can't do that, but what would it take to get a B in the class? So an 80, and if I solve that, let's see if it can even find an answer for that. So, okay, it did find a solution for a B. And as we found out before, we only need a 43.5 on the final for a B. So I think what we found with the solver, I'm going to keep that solution, was that we couldn't get an A. Actually, I'm going to cancel that. We got an A with goal seek because we didn't put any constraints on it, but we couldn't get the A with the solver solution because we put some realistic constraints, or what we felt like were realistic constraints on it. So again, it's goal seek on steroids. A couple of quirks about it. Notice that solver remembers these inputs, but when I go to goal seek, what did we say that was? Alt A, WG. All it does is pre-populates the cell that I have selected. It doesn't remember whether I tried to make an 80 or a 90 the last time I used this. However, if I don't like that result, I can undo it from goal seek, but I can't undo it from solver. And in the deep dive video, we may touch on a few more differences between those two. Before I talk about form controls, I should apologize. I think I made a mistake earlier in the video when I said that goal seek was everyone's favorite function machine technique. I think form controls might be everyone's favorite function machine technique. With form controls, you can change inputs with a click of a mouse. What we do is we go to Developer, Insert, and it pulls up this form controls palette. Now we never want to use the bottom half of this, which is ActiveX controls, because they don't link to cells, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So let's cross that out. And what this does allows us to draw things like this little checkbox. So let's say we wanted to have our course grade model accommodate a 3-point curve or high, medium, or low study efforts. So let's jump over into Excel and see how we might apply that. The first thing we need to do is see if we have the Developer tab. And so I do. I've got the Developer tab, which has that Insert menu on it with the form controls, but also those ActiveX controls that we're never going to use. If you don't have the Developer tab, go to File, Options, and Customize your ribbon. And click that box to turn the Developer tab on. And then you can say OK, and you'll have the Developer tab. And you can choose any of these form controls, but don't choose any of these ActiveX controls. Now, to build this little dashboard, I'm going to call it, the first thing I'm going to do is pick a space. And I'm actually going to put a gray border around this one. So I'll do an Alt-HH to go to the Home menu and pull up the color palette for shading cells. I'm going to choose a medium gray here for the outline. I'll select the left and Control select the right columns and make them about the size of that a row is high, and you'll see why in a moment. So I can come in here and select an interior and do an Alt-HH to go to Home and Color Palette, and then I'll move my mouse cursor around. I think we'll go with that color right there. And now we have a place to put these. So let's go back to Developer, Insert, and first let's insert, what did we have, a checkbox, I believe. So if the checkbox were to represent a 3-point curve, I don't know if there should be a hyphen in that or not, a 3-point curve, and then we wanted to insert a group box to represent our study effort. And within that group box, we wanted an option button for high study effort. And rather than draw it again, I'm just going to right click on it and copy, paste, paste. Now watch this. If I try to line those up, would you pay for software that looked like that? No. So let's line them up. First, let's choose one with a right click and then hold down Control, right click, Control, right click. And now let's go to the shape format and align these things. I want to not only align them to the left, but also distribute them vertically. And we'll do a lot more of this in the deep dive. But doesn't that look so much nicer? Looks like something you might pay for, as opposed to something made in someone's garage. Okay, so we need to make these controls affect our model. But before I do, I don't want to forget this. I'm going to show you a cool little trick here to put an optical illusion on this. Right now we just have kind of a gray box and a blue box. So let me come over here and do an Alt-HBM for borders more. And I'm going to choose the widest line I can, a white border, and I'm going to put that on the top and the left. And then I'm going to get a very dark border, dark gray, and put it on the right and the bottom. And look what happens now. I have this optical illusion from those colored borders that makes this thing look like it stands out. So make it look even a little bit more professional there. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to link this little checkbox. So this will be our curve, and this will be our linked cell. I always like to color these linked cells yellow, but I'm not going to click on that yellow button. I'm going to do an Alt-HH, use my arrows, because I want to get you used to using these keyboard shortcuts. So that's for our curve, and this is for our study effort. Now the reason we like the form controls is on a form control you can right click and format it, and you can find something under control that says cell link. And so if I go to the cell link and go to that yellow cell, and by the way, that would look better if I'd click on that 3D shading, but it doesn't change how it works. Now watch what happens. When I click on this, it says either true or false. True or false. Clicking this changes this cell. Well, if I have a cell here, I can tie a formula here to it. So let's say possible curve. And let's come over here and let's say that our course average equals that plus, oh, I didn't give it a possible curve. Possible curve is 3, and we may want to actually change that, so I'm going to format it as an input. So the way this works is our course average is whatever we calculate plus this times the possible curve. Now this is a Boolean, right? True, false means Boolean, which 1, 0 means Boolean as well. And so if Excel sees us using a false in a mathematical expression, it will treat it as a 0. If it sees it's using a true in a mathematical expression, it will treat it as a 1. And so now we have a way to say, well, if they do come through with a 3-point curve instead of an 80, we make an 83. So check that out. So here's a nice little way for your liberal arts roommate to be able to use your model that you build for their grades. And they don't have to know how to write these kind of formulas. All they have to know is how to click that checkbox. And so this is a pretty basic way to use the checkbox. It's going to link to a cell that gives it true or false. We're going to use some math that multiplies that by some other value. Now, this is just the introductory video. We'll go over all this stuff in the deep dive, but I wanted you to see how to start using a checkbox. The next thing I want you to see how to use is these group buttons. So if I right click, go to Control, and link that cell here. And I like 3D shading on all these things, so I'm going to 3D shade that. And in fact, I'm going to 3D shade them all. If I go to Home, there's this little option here that lets me select objects. And so if I can select all those at the same time, let me Shift. And now I only have the 3 option buttons: Format Object, Control, and click the 3D shading. It was mixed because one was shaded and the other 2 were not. But now all 3 will be 3D shaded. And now when I double click, it takes me back to my regular cursor. So when I click on this, puts a 1 in there. When I click on this, puts a 2 in there. When I click on this, puts a 3 in there. Because actually all 3 of those are linked to this cell. Remember, I only linked 1, but when I right click and format on one of the others, it sees that it's also linked. Because we all know from years of living in the world with computers that when we see these 3 little buttons inside of this outside group box, then that means that only one of them can be selected, but they're all going to affect the same thing. That's very intuitive, or should be for you. So now how do we use that to affect our study effort? So I'm going to say quiz for final exam. If my study effort is high, I'll bet I make a 99 on quiz 4 and a 94 on the final. If my quiz effort is medium, let's make up say an 85 and an 88. And if my study effort is low, I still think I can pull out a 75 and probably a 75 on the final as well. Hope I'm not being too optimistic there. So now let's come over here, and instead of just entering the 65, let's say, why don't you use this keyword called index and pull something off of this list based on what's in that cell. In other words, index, if it's a 1, pull the first thing off. If it's a 2, pull the second thing off. If it's a 3, pull the third thing off. And let's see if that works. So now we've got a 99 with high effort, an 85 with medium effort, and with low effort, we see our 75 in here. So I want to do basically the same thing down here in the final. So I'm going to copy the formula, hit F2, Shift Home, and copy that formula. And then I'm just going to paste the formula in here. If I'd copied the cell, now I've messed up all my data tables, but we won't worry about that. If I copied the cell, then my references would be off. We'll get to that when we talk about modeling rules. So all I have to do now is change that range to that range. And let's double check. High study effort should get me a 99 and a 94. Medium should get me an 88. 85 and 88 rather. And low should get me a 75 and a 75. And so we can start to control this model with form controls. We built a dashboard to make it clear where they are. We didn't have to do any of that. That's all just formatting. But it sure makes it a lot easier to draw the attention of our user to how they're going to control the model. So this was the 4th of our 5 function machine techniques. The 5th is Monte Carlo simulation. And this is where we do a very special thing with a data table on a blank cell. Instead of putting one number in, we select from some roll of the dice, random distribution, or a bell curve that we have some understanding of. So we sample a distribution of inputs, and we do that many times. Every time we pull one out of this sample, we throw it in a pile over here, and eventually that pile starts to build its own distribution. And it was actually created for gambling in Monte Carlo casinos when they realized that some of these casino games are just too hard to solve mathematically. But if you simulate playing them enough times, if you sample enough inputs, whether it's roll of the dice or draw of the card or spin of the roulette wheel, if you do that enough times and keep track of the statistics of your output, then you'll get a pretty good understanding of how that model works. And so in the deep dive video, I won't do it here, we will come back and look at how to use data table on a blank cell to do this. Let's review. So like those function machines from second grade, our models are going to convert inputs into outputs by applying a math rule or by applying a whole lot of spreadsheet calculations that we call models. These function machine techniques are going to use this function machine analogy or framework, if you will, to answer these 5 types of questions. If I simply want to get a list of outputs that corresponds to a list of inputs, probably the way I'm going to ask that on a quiz is, what is the sensitivity of my course grade to my final exam score? And we'd use a what-if data table for that. On the other hand, if I said, what final exam score do I need to get a certain grade in the course, we'd use a goal seek for that. Unless we wanted to put it on steroids and apply a lot of constraints, and then we'd say what inputs, so we could vary multiple inputs if we chose to, would we optimize an output within certain constraints. So again, if it were profit instead of course grade, maybe we would want to maximize that profit. Maybe getting the 90 wouldn't be just enough. And then form controls. How can we let someone else use our model who doesn't know how to use the formulas but wouldn't mind going in there and clicking with the mouse? And that was the form controls. And again, I'll wait for the deep dive on this one, but what is the range of outputs? We can also say, what's the likelihood of meeting a goal based on certain inputs? That's our Monte Carlo simulation, which we can also call data table on a blank cell. So thank you for watching this record-long video. I think it's a good holistic picture of all the things we're going to do with our function machines. But again, the deep dive will give you a little bit more detail so you can actually start doing this yourself. Have a great day.